Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts. Those of us who can't resist digging into the deep end of big questions, ever find yourself pondering the very nature of reality? Like, what if, at its core, absolutely nothing has a fixed inherent nature? I mean, it kind of shakes the foundations of how we usually think about things, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It really challenges that ingrained notion that everything has some sort of essential, unchanging essence. It's a big shift to even wrap your head around.
Right. And it's a journey we're going to take with a guide who really knew how to tackle these radical philosophical explorations, Nagarjuna.
Ah, Nāgārjuna. You're talking about a towering figure in Buddhist thought, often considered second only to the Buddha himself in terms of influence. His ideas had such staying power, they've shaped philosophical discussions in Asia for centuries and still make waves in contemporary thought today.
No kidding. And his middle way, the Madhyamaka philosophy, revolves around this mind-bending concept of emptiness shunyata. But just so we're clear, this isn't about some simple void. It's a deeply nuanced challenge to the very idea of inherent existence, which is known as Svabhāva.
Precisely. And this concept of Svabhāva is key here. It's what Nāgārjuna argues things are empty of. And really understanding that is crucial to unlocking the true meaning of emptiness in this philosophy.
And for our deep dive today, we're going to rely on a fantastic resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Nagarjuna. They really lay out the groundwork for understanding his thought.
It's an invaluable guide, that's for sure.
So let's get to it. Our mission today is to explore Nagarjuna's concept of emptiness and how it critiques this notion of svabhava, this inherent existence. And the Stanford Encyclopedia even points out that translating svabhava can be tricky. You've got inherent existence, intrinsic nature, substance, essence. None of them quite hit the mark perfectly in Nagarjuna's system.
Yeah, it's a multi-layered concept for sure.
Okay, before we dive too deep, maybe we should take a quick peek at the man himself. Our source mentions that details about Nagarjuna's life are a bit sketchy. We're not exactly swimming in biographical facts, but it's generally agreed that he was a Buddhist monk, probably living in southern India sometime around the 2nd century CE.
Yeah, the exact details are a bit fuzzy, maybe even embellished a bit over time. But what is undeniable is the impact and sheer volume of philosophical work he left behind.
For real. We're talking a massive body of writings. Our source breaks it down into 3 categories: argumentative works, hymns, and letters. And while those hymns and letters definitely have value, it's those argumentative works that are our main focus today, especially, the Mulamattamaka Karika, or MMK, which is often translated as fundamental wisdom of the middle way,
Right,
right?
absolutely. The MMK is foundational. All subsequent Madhyamaka thought basically builds on the arguments Nagarjuna lays out in those 450 incredibly concise stanzas.
That's amazing. But it wasn't his only work, right?
Oh, not at all. There's also the Yuktitaki 60 stanzas on reasoning, which really digs into this idea of emptiness and dependent origination.
Okay, so emptiness isn't just about things lacking inherent existence. It's also about how they come to be in the first place, right? Through dependence on other things.
Exactly. And then there's the Sunyata Saptati, 70 stanzas on emptiness, which touches on things like agency and the important distinction between the two truths, conventional and ultimate truth.
Ah, yes, the two truths. It's a central concept in Buddhist thought, right? But we can dig into that a bit later. What else did Nagarjuna write?
Well, there's the Vigrahavyavartani, the dispeller of disputes, where he takes on and dismantles objections to his philosophy head-on. And then there's the Vedalya Prakarna, the treatise on pulverization, which really targets the Nyaya school of thought and their logical framework.
And then you've got the Ratnavali, the precious garland, which takes on ethical and political philosophy, but from this lens of emptiness. And then you've got the Katustaba, his hymns. So basically, he was grappling with a huge range of philosophical and spiritual issues, all unified by this core insight into emptiness.
Exactly. And as we said, the linchpin connecting all of this is the concept of emptiness, shunyata, and how it dismantles this idea of svabhava.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of it. When we talk about emptiness, we're always talking about the emptiness of something. And for Nagarjuna, that something is svabhava. We've mentioned the different translations, but what exactly does svabhava mean in this philosophical context? For a fellow philosopher listening, what are the specific nuances we need to really get here?
Okay, so the Stanford Encyclopedia smartly breaks down svabhava into 2 main aspects. There's the ontological dimension, which is about how objects exist in themselves, and the cognitive dimension, which is about how we as humans conceptualize and understand those objects. And within that ontological dimension, there are 3 main understandings of Svabhāva that were floating around in Nagarjuna's time.
Okay, 3. Let's break those down.
So first you've got Svabhāva understood as essence. Think of it like this, that fundamental property, a thing absolutely must have to be what it is. That classic example is the heat of fire. Like if it's not hot, is it really fire? Or the fluidity of water. If water isn't wet, is it even water anymore?
Right, that makes intuitive sense, like getting at the core of what something is.
Exactly. But here's the thing. While this idea of essence becomes a big deal for later Madhyamaka thinkers, our source points out that it wasn't Nāgārjuna's main target in his critique of Svabhāva. He would probably argue that even those seemingly essential properties don't have inherent existence, but his focus was elsewhere.
Interesting. So what was he really going after?
The second understanding, Svabhāva as substance, or primary existence. To understand this, you need to know a bit about pre-Nāgārjuna Buddhist thought, particularly the Abhidharma schools. They made this distinction between primary existence, called Dravyasad, and secondary existence, called Prajñaptisad. The Dravyasad were considered the truly real, irreducible building blocks of reality, like momentary flashes of consciousness or basic sensory data.
Just so we're like the ultimate Lego bricks existing all on their own with everything else built from them.
Exactly. And everything else, the tables and chairs, even our mental states, those were all secondary existence, the Prajñaptisad. They depended on our concepts and language and mental constructions, so they weren't considered ultimately real. And in this context, having Svabhāva basically meant being at the Dravyasad, a primary existent. It meant existing independently, objectively, forming the bedrock of reality.
Got it. So Nāgārjuna is tackling this idea that there's a fundamental level of reality, these independent things that don't need anything else to exist.
Exactly. And his whole project is basically a sustained argument against that. He says that absolutely everything, no exceptions, arises in dependence on other factors.
See, and this is where that nihilism accusation pops up, right? Like, if you're saying there's no bedrock, no independent things, aren't you saying nothing exists at all?
Right, but that's a huge misunderstanding, and our source is very clear about that. First off, it's not even clear if you can formulate a coherent idea of ontological nihilism, the idea that nothing exists. And the Madhyamikas themselves really emphasized their middle way. They rejected both substantialism, which is the belief in inherent existence, and nihilism. Emptiness for them isn't about denying all existence, just a very specific kind of existence, this inherent, independent kind.
Okay, so he's not saying nothing exists. He's being very precise about what kind of existence he's rejecting. What about that third understanding of Svabhāva, the one about absolute reality?
Yeah, this is where things get a bit tricky. Sometimes, Svabhāva is used to describe the ultimate nature of things. Something uncaused, unchanging, totally independent. The problem is, emptiness, shunyat itself, is also often described in similar terms. So it seems like you've got this paradox. Something both exists as the true nature of things and doesn't exist as substance.
Whoa, now that's a head-scratcher for sure. How do they resolve that within the Madhyamaka tradition?
Well, the commentary literature offers some important distinctions. One way to unpack it is to think about the meaning of independence. When Madhyamaka rejects Svabhāva, it's primarily rejecting the idea that something could be independent of any other object or condition. But you can also say emptiness isn't dependent on anything specific, like it's not limited to or defined by one particular thing.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction. So emptiness isn't some separate absolute reality sitting out there, but rather the lack of this inherent substantial nature within everything.
Precisely. Emptiness isn't some primordial reality before or beyond things. It's about the absence of inherent independence in things. And so, as our source explains, what Nāgārjuna is really getting at is the difference between understanding Svabhāva as an unchanging essential property versus Svabhāva as a self-sufficient, independent substance.
Okay, that's really helpful. Now, you mentioned a cognitive dimension to Svabhāva earlier. How does that fit into all of this?
This is where things get really interesting because for Nāgārjuna, understanding the non-existence of Svabhāva isn't just some abstract philosophical game. It has real-world implications. He argues that it's actually the key to liberation from suffering.
Whoa, okay, big claim. How does he make that connection?
Well, he says this belief in Svabhāva as substance isn't just a concept, it's how our minds tend to work. It's like a built-in default mode. We automatically superimpose permanence and solidity and independence onto a world that's actually fluid and interconnected. We think of ourselves as this fixed self, and we see objects as having this unchanging inherent nature.
So it's not just about how things are, but how our minds are wired to see them.
Exactly. And according to Buddhist teachings, this kind of thinking is a big source of our suffering. We cling to things we think are permanent, we get averse to change, and it creates a lot of inner turmoil. And it's important to remember that there's a difference between intellectually grasping emptiness and actually realizing it on a deeper level. You can be convinced by the arguments, but that doesn't necessarily change how you experience the world. It's that profound realization of emptiness that can shift your perception.
Our source uses the Muller-Lyer illusion to illustrate this, right? You can know the lines are the same length, but they still look different.
Exactly. Madhyamaka isn't just about giving you the correct intellectual map. It's about transforming how you experience and interact with the world.
Okay, so now we know what Svabhāva is. It's the target of Nāgārjuna's critique of emptiness. But how does he actually go about arguing against it? Does he have like a single killer argument that just blows the whole concept out of the water?
It's interesting, actually. Our source points out that Nāgārjuna doesn't really offer a single master argument like some other philosophical systems. And that strategy is actually connected to his rejection of Svabhāva.
Whoa, meta, how so?
Well, if nothing has an inherent independent nature, then no argument can stand completely on its own.
Right.
It's all going to depend on context, premises, the understanding of the audience.
Ah, so he's approaching it more like a systematic deconstruction, step by step.
Exactly. If someone believes in the inherent existence of something, he uses logic to show how that thing actually lacks Svabhāva. And the specific argument depends on what he's critiquing. But there are some areas where humans are really prone to projecting Svabhāva. And a lot of Madhyamaka literature, especially the MMK, focuses on those areas.
Okay, let's get into those areas. Our source starts with causation. How does he tackle that?
Well, Nāgārjuna looks at a whole bunch of possible ways cause and effect could be related. He considers things like self-causation, causation from other things, causation from both, and causation from neither. And then he very carefully shows how each of those options either leads to logical contradictions or just doesn't make sense in light of our experience.
Self-causation does seem tricky right off the bat. How does he approach that?
So in Buddhist philosophy back then, there were two main ideas about self-causation. One was that the cause and effect are basically the same thing, and the other was that the effect is somehow already contained within the cause. The idea that something persists through time and causes itself runs into the problem of, well, time. A cause usually comes before its effect, and nothing can be before itself,
Well,
right?
that creates a time paradox.
Exactly. And the idea that the effect is hidden in the cause is also tough to swallow. Like if you analyze the parts of a cause, say the fuel, oxygen, and spark that cause fire, you don't find the actual flame and heat already existing in those components, right?
Okay, that makes sense. What about the idea of causation from something else? That seems more intuitive.
Nāgārjuna argues that cause and effect can't be truly independent from each other either. His main point is that the effect totally depends on the cause. No cause, no effect. But he also says the cause depends on the effect, at least in a conceptual way. Like you wouldn't even call something a cause if it never actually caused anything, right?
Interesting. So the very idea of causation implies they're not independent.
Right. If they were totally independent, how could they even relate to each other as cause and effect?
What about that third option, causation, from both itself and other things?
So this view tries to explain the complexity of the world by saying that a cause might have the potential for an effect within it, and then external conditions make that potential a reality. Like a seed, which has the potential for a sprout, but it needs water and sunlight to actually sprout. Nāgārjuna would say this still doesn't support inherent existence. That potential in the seed is still dependent on things, and the sprout relies totally on external stuff. Nothing in that process is truly self-sufficient.
And what about that last one, causation from neither? Isn't that just denying causation altogether?
Yep, pretty much. And Nāgārjuna says that creates a huge problem. If there's no causation, then how do we understand the world? Our knowledge seems based on cause and effect. If there were no causal link between our senses and the world, how can we know anything?
Right. Our whole experience of reality seems built on cause and effect.
Exactly. So Nāgārjuna isn't denying that we experience causation. He's questioning our understanding of it. He's challenging that deep-seated assumption that cause and effect have some kind of inherent, independent existence.
He's really peeling back the layers of our assumptions, huh?
He is. He argues that cause and effect are completely intertwined. It's not just how we label them. Their very being is interconnected. He gets into the different ways you can interpret this dependence. Like, is being a cause just an essential property? Or does the property of being a cause depend on there being an effect? Does the whole causal field depend on the effect it produces?
And this mutual dependence, no matter how you slice it, goes against the idea of independent Svabhāva, right?
Absolutely. And Nāgārjuna goes further, saying this web of dependence extends to us too, the ones observing and thinking about it all. Our very act of dividing the world into causes and effects is part of how they seem to exist. So the whole causal field, the cause, the effect, all of it is ultimately empty of inherent existence.
And you said this ties into the idea of universal emptiness.
Yeah, if things that are causally related depend on us to even think of them as cause and effect, then, in a deep sense, they're conceptually constructed and thus empty. This is a huge difference from some other Buddhist schools, like certain Abhidharma schools, that try to reconcile causation with inherent existence.
Okay, so inherent existence takes a hit in the realm of causation. What's next on Nāgārjuna's list?
Change. Specifically, the phenomenon of motion. Our source points out that motion gets a lot of attention in Nāgārjuna's arguments. Some scholars even compare it to Zeno's paradoxes. But his main goals seem to be to dismantle those substantialist views that say things have inherent existence and then change, and also to challenge how we think about the relationship between individuals and their properties.
He uses two main arguments here, right? The property absence argument and the property duplication argument.
Exactly. The property absence argument looks at statements like, the mover moves, Nāgārjuna asks. Can you even imagine a mover that exists without moving? It's not like a blue vase where you can picture the vase existing without being blue. A mover seems inherently defined by its motion, right? This points to a dependence of the mover on motion, which goes against the idea of it having some independent Svabhāva that's just combined with motion.
So it's not like the mover is something separate that then does the moving.
Exactly. And the property duplication argument looks at it differently. If you have a moving mover, it seems like you'd need two motions. The one that makes it a mover in the first place, and then the actual motion it's doing. This highlights a problem with separating what we call constitutive properties, the ones that make a thing what it is, from instantiated properties, the ones it happens to have at a certain time.
Right, because in a moving mover, that distinction sort of breaks down.
Exactly. And he extends this even further to our understanding of regular objects, like that blue vase. If this distinction between constitutive and instantiated properties is so fuzzy with a moving mover, maybe it's not a fundamental distinction at all, even with the vase.
So it could be that our way of dividing the world into objects and properties is just how we think, not how things really are.
Precisely. It might be a matter of convenience, not some reflection of independent substances and properties.
Okay, so that's a pretty big challenge to how we usually see things.
And this analysis of change also has big implications for Buddhist ideas like cyclic existence, samsara.
Right, the idea of rebirth.
If those fundamental building blocks, like mover and motion, don't have Svabhāva and are interdependent, then the whole idea of a solid person traveling through rebirth, and even rebirth itself as a fixed thing, all that gets called into question. Nāgārjuna's analysis of change basically wants to show that this distinction we make between a thing and its changing properties, well, that distinction depends on our minds, on how we conceptualize things.
It's all connected back to that cognitive dimension of Svabhāva.
Exactly. And this even ties into the philosophical problem of substance. When you're trying to think about something like a spatially extended object and strip away all its properties, what are you left with? This bare particular. It seems like you either end up with an infinite regress or an empty, unknowable something.
It's like if you take away everything that makes a thing what it is, what's left? Just a big question mark.
Right. And even if you look at something like trope theory, where reality is made up of particularized properties instead of substances, you still run into the problem of grouping those properties into coherent things without needing dependence or relationships, which undermine inherent existence. It seems like anytime you try to analyze things as individuals and properties, you hit a snag.
Okay, so no inherent existence in change and motion either. What's next?
Personal identity, the idea of the self. This fits perfectly with the Buddha's own teaching that there's no permanent, unchanging self, Atman. Nāgārjuna builds on that and argues against any notion of a self as this separate, fixed thing that exists apart from our ever-changing mental and physical states.
And here, he's probably echoing some of the Buddha's core teachings, right? Emphasizing that our five aggregates form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness are all impermanent and interdependent, with no lasting independent self at the core.
Exactly. But Nāgārjuna adds his own philosophical spin to it. He takes on this common objection to the no-self idea head-on That question. If there's no self, then who's having all these experiences like seeing, feeling, thinking? Don't those mental events need a self to happen to? The underlying worry is that you need a foundation, a me, that's doing the experiencing.
Right, like a stable I that's behind it all.
Yeah, but Nāgārjuna says we don't actually need to invent this substantial self just because we have experiences. Remember that distinction between constitutive and instantiated properties. He uses that here too, like with the blue vase or the moving mover, saying these experiences belong to a self might just be how we think and talk, not some fundamental reality that needs a separate self-substance. He even calls the self a shifting coalition of psychophysical elements, always in flux.
That's a really cool way to put it. But what about that immediate feeling of I-ness we all have? Doesn't that suggest there is a real, enduring self?
Well, Nāgārjuna also looks at the epistemology of the self. How do we know this self if it exists? If the self is this unchanging subject that has experiences, how can it also be an object that we can know or observe?
Right, it seems like you can't be both the subject and the object at the same time.
Exactly. And if you try to introspect, to directly observe this self, you don't find some fixed thing, do you? You just find thoughts, feelings, sensations constantly changing. And inferring that there's a permanent self based on these fleeting experiences seems a bit shaky, especially if the self is supposed to be so immediately known.
So how does he explain self-awareness without a substantial self?
He suggests that maybe the self isn't a fixed thing, but rather a sequence of interconnected mental and physical events over time. In that case, the same event could be the subject of an experience in one moment and then become part of what's being observed in the next moment. You don't need a permanent, unchanging self to ground the experience of self-awareness.
It's like a constant flow of experience, and in each moment, a part of that flow becomes the I that's aware.
Exactly. The self is more like a continuous but ever-changing stream, not a fixed entity.
And why can't those individual events that make up the self, those mental and physical bits, be considered inherently existing things on their own?
Because remember, Nāgārjuna says everything depends on other things. Even those basic parts of our experience, they only make sense within the context of a self. Their very identity depends on being part of that conceptually constructed self. So they can't be ultimate independent things either.
Ah, it all circles back. And he uses that analogy of a magic illusion to explain how we can have agency and experience consequences even without a fixed self, right?
Yes. The analogy helps explain how we can function in the world and make choices that have real impacts, even if there's no ultimate doer behind those actions. It's like, within the illusion, your actions have consequences, even though from outside the illusion, you know it's all smoke and mirrors.
Right, so you're not denying the reality of our experience, you're just reframing it. That's a crucial point for maintaining ethics and responsibility. Okay, so we've covered causation, change, and the self. What else does Nāgārjuna tackle?
Knowledge itself. He dives into a critique of the pramoa, the instruments of knowledge, and the objects of knowledge, things like perception, inference, analogy, and testimony. He's not really focused on what these instruments are, but on how we know they're valid, how we know they give us accurate knowledge.
He looks at different ways to establish their validity, right? Like mutual coherence, self-establishment, and mutual establishment.
Exactly. The idea of establishing validity through mutual coherence, saying a set of beliefs are valid just because they fit together, doesn't really fly for Nāgārjuna. He points out that you can have a perfectly consistent story that's totally made up. His focus is on self-establishment and mutual establishment.
So what's wrong with self-establishment? This idea that instruments of knowledge can validate themselves.
Well, it might seem appealing at first, because you avoid that infinite regress of needing another instrument to validate the first one. But Nāgārjuna has some problems with it. First, if something like perception was truly self-established, it would have to exist and work without any object to perceive. But perception is all about perceiving something, right? It's inherently about a subject and an object. To be self-established, perception would have to be its own object, like the perceiver and the perceived all at once. And that creates a paradox, kind of like the mover-moved problem. An action takes place over time, so it can't be both the actor and the acted upon at the same time.
Right, so that creates some logical knots. What's the second issue with self-establishment?
Even if you could get around that subject-object problem, there's the problem of justification. Like, how do you connect an internal quality of a cognitive tool to its accuracy in representing the external world? If you have all these mental tools, how do you know one is reliable and another isn't if they're only validated by themselves? Our source gives this example. Imagine you're picking a tin opener. You can look at all the gears and levers inside, but the only way to know if it's good is to actually try it on a tin can. In the same way, you can only judge your cognitive tools by how they interact with what they're supposed to be knowing. But that means you're already referring to the objects of knowledge, so it's not purely self-established anymore.
Okay, so self-establishment seems shaky. What about mutual establishment? This idea that the tools of knowledge and the objects of knowledge validate each other.
Well, the first problem with that is circularity, right? To say an object, like an apple, proves perception is valid because we successfully perceive, it seems like you already need to know there's an apple. But those who support mutual establishment have a more subtle view. They say it's about how well our perception and inference let us navigate and interact with the world over time. If they consistently work, then that's a kind of practical justification for their reliability.
But how do you even define what working means without relying on other cognitive tools that you might not have validated yet?
That's the issue Nāgārjuna raises. You might say something like, we know our perception of the apple is accurate because it matches our memory of buying apples, or because we can successfully eat it. But then what about the accuracy of those memories?
It's like an endless chain of needing to validate one thing with another.
Exactly. So what's Nāgārjuna's big takeaway about knowledge? He's not saying knowledge is impossible. What he's saying is that nothing is intrinsically an instrument or object of knowledge. It's all about how they relate to each other. The instrument gives us access to what we think is an object, and interacting with that object makes us think the instrument is reliable. But this mutual dependence means neither of them has inherent independent existence, no Svabhāva.
Right, because they need each other to make sense. And that brings us to the last topic our source mentions: language and truth.
This isn't something Nāgārjuna wrote about as extensively, but there are still some key points. The big thing is that emptiness and a ready-made world just don't go together. You can't have a world where everything has a fixed inherent nature and then say language simply mirrors that world.
And that leads to rejecting the correspondence theory of truth, right? The idea that a statement is true if it perfectly matches reality.
Exactly. With no inherent existence, there's nothing for language to perfectly correspond to. And even something like the causal theory of reference, which tries to link words to the world through causal connections, well, that becomes problematic too, because Nāgārjuna says those causal relations are themselves conceptually constructed, empty of Svabhāva.
Right, so everything's interconnected. So if he rejects the correspondence theory, what does he offer in its place?
Our source mentions the idea of assertability conditions. In this view, a statement is true if you have good reasons to assert it. These reasons could be things like observations, coherence with other beliefs, or practical success. What this means is that there are no truths that are totally beyond our ability to know, no mind-independent truths in a strong sense.
And this fits with his view of knowledge, right?
Okay.
Where what's valid and what you can know depends on the context.
Yes. If nothing is intrinsically an instrument of knowledge, then nothing is completely beyond the reach of knowledge. What counts as a valid instrument and what can be known are relative to our conceptual frameworks, our language, and our practices.
So is he saying that all truth is basically conventional truth? Something we agree on within our systems of language and thought?
That's the general idea in Madhyamaka. But it's important not to think of these conventional truths as just distortions of some real, non-conceptual reality. Because from Nāgārjuna's point of view, the very idea of a non-conceptual reality that exists apart from our ways of thinking is nonsensical. We can't access the world without language and concepts.
But if there's no ultimate truth to aim for, doesn't that kill our motivation to question things?
A Madhyamaka might say that it can be helpful to act as if some truths are more than just conventions, like there's a more objective truth we're trying to uncover. This can motivate us to keep investigating and refine our understanding.
But doesn't that lead right back to believing in non-conventional truth?
Not necessarily. It's more like a useful strategy, a way to guide our investigations without actually committing to the existence of ultimate mind-independent truth.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's that really crucial question. If all truth is conventional, then emptiness can't be an ultimate truth either, right?
Exactly. Emptiness, or shunyata, isn't a description of reality as it exists all on its own, independent of us. It's a tool to correct our mistaken belief in Svabhāva. It's not saying reality itself is empty in some inherent way. It's pointing out that things don't have this property of inherent existence that we mistakenly project onto them. So the whole theory of emptiness isn't meant to be ultimately true in the sense of describing a mind-independent reality. It's meant to help us see through our mistaken beliefs.
Wow. So to sum it all up, Nāgārjuna goes through all these areas: causation, change, the self, knowledge, language, truth, and he finds this consistent lack of inherent existence, the Svabhāva. Everything is dependent and conceptually constructed.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember this isn't nihilism. It's not denying the reality of our experience. It's a different way of understanding reality, a much more fluid and interconnected view than we're used to.
So, for our listeners out there who love philosophy, Nāgārjuna's work is a call to rethink some of those fundamental assumptions we have, even in Western philosophy. Things like substance, causality, identity, knowledge, truth. He's asking us to question it all. Expert speaker.